The rise of global fascism. I already talked about this topic on my posts or videos before, but not too much about Latin America. Given there's only two countries in Latin America that are under fascist rule, El Salvador under Bukele and Argentina with Milei, but now with Colombia as well recently. And they all have the same root cause, drug cartels, specifically the Mexican drug war. But people forget that the Mexican drug war was started by capitalism, and it could be easily prevented without US intervention. Given that Mexican drug war is one of the three or four deadliest war in the world right now, the other would be the Russian-Ukraine war, the Sudanese civil war, the Ethiopian civil war, and the US-Israel war against Iran. Given that 3% of the Mexican economy is controlled by the cartels and 30% of the Mexican government has either shared control or no control with the cartels. But the US refused to take accountability because 75% of all weapons are smuggled from the US, primarily Texas, to Mexico. The Zetas, who revolutionized the brutality that cartels are known for nowadays, were founded by US Special Forces, trained by the elite Delta Force. Other examples are US complicit crime lords, like active collaboration with Afghan warlords for decades, like the Afghan Style Papers, or support fascist dictators like Salvador Bukele, who has been exposed being connected with gangs despite his war on crime rhetoric. And with the CIA. The CIA has a long history of making their own drug empire, created the world's first global drug empire and connection by promoting and protecting opium trade in China. The US supported the fascist Kuomintang-controlled China despite being a narco-state, with opium being the main source, which Paul Helliway was in charge of the opium trade in China to defeat the Maoists. The CIA used Operation X and Operation Underworld to create heroin trade in Southeast Asia, mainly Thailand. It created a multi-ethnic supermafia to combat any left-wing sentiment. The CIA brought crack to the US by collaboration with Central American reactionary groups like the Contras, and helped Nazis to make coup in Bolivia, also known as the Cocaine Coup, which became a Nazi Fourth Reich-style government that lasted only a couple months, which gave easy and legal access for Pablo Escobar, causing the mess that Mexico suffers today. And the CIA gave a drug lord, Manuel Noriega, power in Panama, while the most powerful cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, was founded by a former intelligence service officer and secret police agent Juan Jose Espargosa Moreno. Although right now the Sinaloa is having a civil war with factions killing each other using balkanization. To actually stop this war to begin with and prevent more rise of fascist dictators in the rest of Latin America, it's not through the war on crime, war on drugs, or war on terror, or whatever war on something, but instead a multi-action approach, like stopping weapons smuggling, which has been overlooked in the United States, change the con culture in the United States, where historically been helping white supremacists, complete discrimination, decriminalization, and legalization of all drugs and sex work, which will lose so much power for the cartels. And look at the Zapatista, an anarchist pacifist society, and it's the only place in Mexico that doesn't have any cartel influence. The real reason why there was the origin of the Mexican drug wars to begin with was the Mexican military and police started the drug business and used cartels as an excuse to maintain their permanent local militarized warlords to suppress left-wing opposition at the time in Mexico. A great book called Cartel Does Not Exist, multiple scholars and journalists who work together on this project prove this is the case. Like for example, Luis Astorga quote, "In the field of power, traffickers have historically been subordinated to the government. They had not been a competition with it or had tried to compete with creative associations or political parties, nor had they developed a far-reaching infiltration, quote unquote, to strategy to reverse this subordinated relationship. There are isolated corruption, especially within the police department, but not an agreed-upon plan between criminal organization or conspiracy to try systematic change that will test the precedent. In other words, the traffickers are some of the social actors whose activities and actions undoubtedly hinder governance but do not pose a threat to political power or the direction of the state." There's also Ignacio Alvarado, who said, "Violence in Mexico is not explained by a war between drug traffickers or dispute over plazas. Moreover, There is no single drug trafficker with the capacity to challenge institutions such as the Army, the Navy, or the Federal Police. Not even the recently imprisoned El Chapo. Nothing supports the government's story. Drugs are only a pretext at the heart of violence. The U.S. State Department's influence on the issue is crucial. Mexico's judicial, energy, tax, and education reforms are being driven by actors at the highest level of U.S. government, with capital interests in mind, and the Merida Initiative is the perfect instrument for the social and political manipulation of the country. The goal of this system of terror is exile, the depopulation of immense territories that are rich in hydrocarbons, minerals, and water. Today, we can see how the energy sector has been affected by such reforms. Private and foreign capital that has been waiting on this moment for 2 decades can now exploit these natural resources. And as been stated before, the Mexican drug cartel, the Golden Age, died in 2006, the same year as the Mexican drug war has officially started. There's also a quote from Don Pelly: "The war on drugs is a long-term fix to capitalism wars, combining terror with policy-making in the seasoned neoliberal mix, cracking open social worlds and territories once unavailable to globalized capitalism. This project is about rethinking what is called the war on drugs. It isn't about prohibition or drug policy. Instead, it looks at how in this war terror is used against the population, cities and rural areas, and how the parallel to this terror and resulting panic, policies that facilitate foreign direct investment and economic growth are implemented. This is a drug war capitalism. Another example will show if the rest of these studies that have been shown. For example, this official monopoly on the discourse on narco is possible because of the history of drug trafficking in Mexico is derived from the history of state prohibition. In other words, state prohibition is a condition of possibility for the existence and development of organized crime. All the more reason for the state to invent a language we use to describe it. As Astora had amply documented how the Mexican state disciplined and subordinate criminal organizations during the second half of the 20th century, forcing them to operate under the control of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, until the mid-1990s, with drug trafficking being a national security issue under absolute state control. The military and police conceived of a smooth and orderly drug trafficking system with a reduced rate of violence. With the fall of the PRI, the police state was gradually dismantled during Vicente Fox's presidency, whose inability to articulate a national security policy allowed new criminal associations between governors, local businessmen, and drug traffickers in states such as Chihuahua, Michoacán, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas. It was in this context that during Felipe Calderon's presidency, the so-called war on drugs was put in place. Michel Foucault, the lack of a rule of law and its subsequent violence actually implied the absolute, orderly, and effective presence of the state. In other words, after the unprecedented wave of homicidal violence, we had the most aggressive biopolitical program in modern Mexican history, far from being a failure. The Mexican state has prevailed. Mexican state sovereignty and its relationship with drug trafficking. It is necessary to remember that according to Luis Astorga, the drug trafficking in Mexico developed under the absolute disciplinary control and the country's political and police system under the PRI. Operation Condor and the subsequent war on drugs are largely the factors that laid the foundation for modern drug cartels, allowing the state to manage the drug trade system out of the country by means of the army and federal police. The Mexican state kept criminal organization under rigorous subordination until the 1990s. In the way violence is integrated into a new local power structure, narco operate with the police department under the political motivation of the political and business classes during the governments, with the common objective of building semi-autonomous and independent jurisdictions independent of the central federal power. The golden age of narcos ended in 2006. This was like Afghanistan, unjustly continuation despite evidence of the state's claim. A study conducted by the Drug Policy Program and the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics, or the CIDE in Spanish, showed that the armed forces rate of lethality grew dramatically during the war on drugs, ordered by Calderon. Between 2007 and 2011, according to the study, 86.1% of the murdered civilians were allegedly confronted by the army and federal police were killed with perfect lethality, that is, in confrontation, where all enemy combatants were killed with no survivors left. All this without federal ministerial police investigation that could prove that the murdered civilian has some link to organized crime. The Mexican Navy had the highest lethality rate at 17.3 deaths for every civilian injured. This is followed by the Mexican Army with 9.1 deaths for injury, and then the federal police with 2.6 deaths per injury. The CIDE research also pointed out that the violence increased by 6% with each combat over a period of 3 months. And even more serious, of the 3,327 documented clashes, 84% were actually caused by the Mexican armed forces, and only 7% were direct attacks against the Mexican armed forces. Alejandro Madrazo, one of the CIDE researchers, interpreted the data ambiguously, and I quote, "The high lethality and perfect lethality levels are very strong indication that we are facing extrajudicial executions or the excessive use of public force." End quote. The foreign powers of the PRI government that disciplined the narcos between the 1970s and 1990s, Fernando Escalante Gonzalbol explains that the murder rate at the national level has shown a significant decrease before the militarization of the country. Starting in 2008, with Army and federal police intervention, the murder rate in various areas of the country increased by 1,000%. A study by a think tank, Mexico Evalúa, showed that the most of these victims were lower-class men with minimal education between 20 and 40 years of age, while the profile of the alleged sicarios detained by the authorities only differed from this profile in that they were 5 years younger on average. The PRR kept organized crime on the margins of political power for decades by using violent repressive police system, state force from federal police to the army, bear great responsibility in the disappearance in 2014 of the 43 normalistas in the state of Guerrero. El Chapo was not the boss. I repeat, El Chapo was not the boss of the great cartel, but at the mercy of the network, the state. There is no cartel war in energy sectors, but rather transnational corporations laying siege, aligned with the interest cooperation of the Mexican political class. WikiLeaks revealed U.S. Department of State strategy to influence Mexico's energy reform. With the democratic transition in 2000, the police state became a security system where local police and politicians have autonomous power without the need of the federal system, and use the cartels as scapegoats and cannon fodder. 800% increase in the murder rate made Juarez the most violent metropolis in the world. He has a lot to do with the fact that some soldiers had co-opted by drug trafficking with ICE, implicated in the killings. The Mexican military, they suspect, could be used to crisis the facility or even get involved in the campaign, what they call quote-unquote social cleansing of the human dump. The undesirables, the drug addicts, the vagrants, and petty thieves are more than the petty thieves. The army practically did not dispel this idea when in press conference on April 1st, 2008, Jorge Juarez Loera, the general in charge of the 11 military districts of which Juarez is a part, described each death that occurred under his surveillance as one less criminal. Crime cannot be fought with crime, neither should the severity of the crisis, because justification for the use of illegal methods or a pretext for turning a blind eye when abuses are committed. The aim of this report is to highlight a great pattern of recent human rights violations that are perpetrated by the means of the Mexican military and to call on the civilian and military authority to take immediate and effective steps to halt and remedy such abuses. Hundreds of reports and cases where citizens of Juarez and other parts of the country were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at the hands of soldiers sent by Calderon in what was known as Joint Operation Chihuahua. The purpose of the DFS was not to contain drug violence, but on the contrary, to manage it and unleash violence against the pro-communist, pro-socialist, pro-anarchist, or pro-indigenous rights movements, as has reported in these cases. In fact, 7 out of 10 attacks against journalists in Mexico were perpetrated by state agencies like the military, not cartels. And this is where the influence of fascism in the United States goes. For example, Carlos Ledel, who was the co-founder of the Medellin cartel, the one that was ruled by Pablo Escobar, founded his own neo-Nazi party, the National Latin Movement. And we see examples throughout Latin America, especially Bolivia with the cocaine coup controlled by a Nazi, literally. But look at the true fascist powers now technically free in power in Latin America. We have Bukele in El Salvador, despite his war on crime rhetoric. He used emergency powers during the crackdown crisis to threaten his hold and effectively make the country an autocracy. And many whistleblowers have been some whistleblowers have been shut down who have fled the country during this chaos in power. A great example that you could find is the article from Rational Wiki, where they analyze that Bukele has a cult of personality. derived from Salvadorians fed up with the political establishment and facing hardship across the country, around himself as a result of his brutal crackdowns, and called himself the world's coolest dictator. Bukele started out as a self-proclaimed radical leftist, but later claimed that he became independent when he entered politics and ran for president. His policies are right-leaning, has a huge right-wing audience inside and outside El Salvador. Este, it is not surprising that many far-right leaders throughout the world have their own code of personality using left-wing languages. He implemented many typical policies like banning abortion and barring LGBT people from society, preventing them from being recognized or even identified in public. And many of the LGBT community face social stigma and brutal crackdown just for being themselves, all in the name of family values and traditional marriages. And they also uncovered reports that Bukele made secret deals with country's gangsters and drug traffickers to make it look like that crime was decreased and his anti-crime crusades were working. And he deflected claim as lies and claimed the previous Salvadorian government had done such shady deals. But in March 2022, there was a significant spike of violence, with members of Bukele's Nuevo Idea suggest that these violent acts were done to try to get Bukele's back to the negotiation table with the country's criminal elements. And we see these politicians getting streamed and grabbing power worldwide. His abuses power against the rights of other people, such as the indigenous, LGBT, feminists, immigrants, homeless, drug addicts, and recreational drug users. It also doesn't help that he has his own fucking concentration camp. Or look at Argentina under Javier Milei, who I quote, he proclaimed himself as a tantric sex guru. Yeah, that was a thing. And asking advice from spirits and the dead dog named Conan. And his relationship, quote unquote, with his sister. Leave that information where you will. And again, all these criminal organizations in El Salvador, for example, like MS-13, one, they're not from El Salvador, they're Salvadorian immigrants from California. And the reason they joined organized crime because of extreme poverty and economic inequality. In fact, according to the FBI's own report, the main cause of crime is economic inequality, aka capitalism. As long as you have economic disparity among the population, they will join organized crime out of survival. And we also use Bukele and Milei using the police and all the armed forces suppress people and pass laws to make it much easier to arrest protesters. Or Bitcoin, for example. Like Milei signed a decree allowing for contractors to be signing Bitcoin, American currency, and milk of all things. And has an informal dollar economy. And decree legalized the informal economy into a blue dollar market. Este, some of his proposal policies include deregulation of rent, extreme privatization, and the termination of over 7,000 civil services contracts. He proposed reforms were unsurprisingly blocked by the Argentinian court, but he also devalued Argentinian currency by 50%, as in at the huge cost to funding for the public infrastructure and transportation. He also advocated for free trade of organs, and he is engaged in heavy crackdowns against protesters and dissidents. And his authoritarian policy was met with even heavier, more massive protests. And he's also a climate change denier. So that there's that. And also Milei's denial of the people who were forcibly disappeared under the military dictatorship during the Dirty War in Argentina, where something around 30,000 people were deemed disappeared. Or that one time that Milei proclaimed himself as Moses and claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. Yes, I will put a link to that because even I didn't believe that shit. And the reason he embraced Judaism, even though he never actually formally converted, because of the dead dog Conan told him to. Specifically, ultra Orthodox Hasidic Judaism, the more esoteric variety. The same thing with Malay hatred of women. If they want to criminalize abortion. We also ban hormone replacement therapy for transgender people under the age of 18. You know, consider LGBT people as cancer. And his advisor suggested to eliminate sex education from school curriculum and showing hardcore pornography for children instead. Yes, I am not making that shit up. That is real. And also cutting funding for medical research, especially people who suffer from cancer. And because of that funding cuts, the worst dengue epidemic in Argentinian history. at least for recent times. And now we have the new leader of, Colombia, Belardo de la Espriera, who was a lawyer for criminals and drug trafficking and cartels. So they give you what he's gonna be in it. He became a prominent figure, and his ties with right-wing paramilitary groups, you know, and other criminal organizations. So he promoted the prohibition of prohibit extraction in Colombia and organized for featuring the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, which is something similar to what Pablo Escobar wanted in the first place when he ran for office. He also publicly supported famous drug traffickers like Salvatore Macuso, you know, and his close alliance with the United Self-Defense Force of Colombia, which is a paramilitary terrorist organization connected with far-right views. So there's that. He said he will authorize the police to shoot protesters if they deem violent, which is basically every protester ever, and threatened to kill suspects of drug trafficking by downing planes and shooting boats, which is considered extrajudicial killing by international law. And implements a similar prison system like Bukele has. So it shows you that these are fascists using collaboration with criminal organizations as an excuse to maintain power. Cartels had no real power besides what the state has claimed. They use them as a scapegoat for their own means.